Once long ago, in the Highlands of Scotland, there lived four men. They were good friends, they were good hunters, and they'd had a very good day of hunting. They intended to hunt again the next day, and so they decided to spend the night in a bothy. Now, a bothy, as you may know, is usually a simple dwelling, left unlocked for travelers or for hunters to stay in. And most bothies are hardly more than a shack. So these four friends were happy to discover that the bothy that they found was a cozy room with a fireplace on one end and a large stack of firewood, a table, and several comfortable chairs. One of the men made a fire. They'd brought food and drink, and so they cooked supper and ate their fill. And finally they sat back to talk about their events of that day, their plans for the next day. It was a good time. And one of the men said, I think this is just about perfect. Another chuckled and said, well, I can think of one thing that would make it more perfect. If there were four beautiful women to spend the evening with us, that would be even better. Well, one of the men chuckled and said, that's certainly not likely. But just at that moment, there was a soft knock at the door. And when one of the hunters opened the door, standing there were four beautiful women. They had long, wavy hair, bright, shining eyes. They were dressed in elegant, long, green gowns. They explained that they'd been on their way to a wedding but had become lost, and so they were very happy to find this place to spend the night. Without even an invitation, they swept into the room, and each one sat down next to one of the hunters. They began to talk. The hunters bragged about what had happened that day, and the women listened attentively and appreciatively. And then after a bit, the four women began to sing a song that was enchanting, almost mesmerizing. And then they beckoned to the men to come and dance with them. And the men were ever so happy to accept the invitation. Well, at least three of them were. The fourth hunter had recently been married to a woman that he adored, and he was loath to betray her loyalty in even the slightest way. And so he was shaking his head and making his excuses about dancing when he noticed something strange. As he watched his friends dancing with those three women, as their green skirts swished to and fro with the dancing, their feet did not seem quite human. They almost looked like deer hoofs. And then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw something much more disturbing. It was a flash of red, and he saw that one of the women had taken a sharp fingernail and had slit the throat of one of his friends, who had fallen to the ground, and the woman was bending over him. It looked like she was drinking his blood. And a moment later, his other two friends had slumped to the ground in the same fashion. Well, the fourth hunter, he tried to keep his face passive, but his mind was racing, and he realized that he had heard talk of such creatures, Baobhan, who were attracted by the smell of blood, and certainly after a day of hunting there was plenty of that about. They seemed to be able to read men's minds and could transform themselves into something enticing and fascinating. Well, the man only knew of two things that could repel such creatures. One was sunlight and the other was iron. But it was hours before dawn, and there was no ready iron about. Still, he knew that if he had any hope of survival, he was going to have to act quickly, and so he bolted out of his chair and out the door, and then he saw the horses that they'd brought with them. And he remembered that just the day before, they had taken those horses to the blacksmith, who had fitted them with new iron horseshoes. Would it be enough? He hoped so. He plunged in among the horses, and in an instant, one of the creatures ran out the door, followed by the other three who had apparently completed their grisly meal, and the four of them began to look for him. They finally spotted him in among the horses, and they came closer and closer, but not too close, because the iron in the horses' horseshoes kept them at a distance, at a safe distance. Well, they began circling about him and trying to get him to come out from among the horses. And at first, they flattered him, they complimented him, they invited him to come back into the bothy and sing with them and dance with them. Of course, he refused. And then their tone changed, and they began to describe with what great glee they had slit the throats of his friends and slurped up their blood. They were hoping to enrage him so much that he would attack them. But that did not work either. Minutes passed, hours passed, and finally they said, "We will have you sooner or later, no matter what you do. You might as well come out now and yield to the inevitable." But just at that moment, the hunter saw the first rays of dawn coming up over the hill, and in that moment, the four creatures disappeared without a trace. They seemed to melt into the morning mist. The man went back into the bothy to look with great sadness at the bodies of his friends. And then he mounted one of the horses and rode back to the village to tell his friends' families of their fate and to warn the other villagers. Finally, the man was reunited with his wife, and he told her of all that had happened since he had left to go hunting the day before. She remembered that her grandmother used to say that if under cover of darkness you were to make a wish, you must also accompany it with a request for a blessing. If you do not do so, then surely the results will be disastrous. And that was evidently what had happened to his friends. And so the fourth hunter and his wife embraced in love and relief that somehow, through a feeling of loyalty and a little bit of luck and some quick thinking, he was the only one of the four who had managed to escape the dreadful fate of the encounter with the Baobhan she.